Imagine abandoning everything you know, your home, your land, your security, to follow the voice of an invisible God. Now imagine waiting decades for a promised son, and when he is finally born, God asks you to do something unthinkable. Sacrifice him with your own hands. This is the story of a man who defied kings, faced battles, and talked directly to God. A man whose name would echo for generations, shaping entire nations. Who was Abraham, the father of faith? And what does this story have to do with you? Stay until the end, because this journey will change the way you see faith, sacrifice, and the destiny of humanity. As the rubble of the great Tower of Babel crumbled into dust, and Noah's generation came to an end, a boy was born in the far south of Mesopotamia. Almost 250 years have passed since the fall of that imposing structure, and humanity has developed new forms of communication, dark and confusing forms, where words are heard without being understood, and sentences are formed without the mouth moving. The societies that emerged after this event completely abandoned the God who created them in his image, and instead began to worship gods shaped in the likeness of their own desires. Small idols of stone and wood, with eyes that don't see and ears that don't hear, became the new oracles. Men now seek answers in pieces of wood and take counsel from the dead. After all, it's much easier to worship what you create. If the gods are the fruit of human hands, then the power to decide between right and wrong lies with each individual, doesn't it? The fragmented world follows its own logic, each people determining what they consider to be right and which path leads to life. But about 140 miles southwest of the ruins of the ancient tower, in an ordinary and unimportant place, a man named Terah sees the birth of his son, Abram, a name that means exalted father. And it is through this child that everything will change, even his own name and destiny. Years pass, and Terah makes a bold decision for his time. He gathers his family and sets off from the city of Ur, in the land of the Chaldeans, towards Canaan. However, his journey is interrupted, and he decides to settle in Haran. But while living there, Abram receives a call that will change his life forever. The call to complete what his father could not. It is interesting to note that the ancient Hebrew writers always understood that Abram and his family were polytheists, worshippers of many gods. However, it is precisely in this context that God's mercy manifests itself. Instead of punishing humanity as it deserves, God shows patience and grace. And it is through this mercy that his power will begin to be revealed to the world. Faced with this divine call, Abram has a choice: to follow the God who has revealed himself to him, or to remain trapped in the empty promises of other gods. The decision is before him, the path of life or the illusion of defining good and evil for himself. So Abram set out, as the Lord had commanded him. Accompanied by his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, Abram is 75 years old when he leaves Haran. Together they take all the goods and servants they have acquired over the years and begin their journey towards Canaan. When they reach the Promised Land, Abram crosses the region to the Oak of Moreh in Shechem. There the Lord appears to him and makes a promise: "To your descendants I will give this land." In response, Abram built an altar in honor of the God who had appeared to him. From there, he went to the mountainous region east of Bethel, pitching his tent between Bethel and Ai. Once again, he erected an altar and invoked the name of the Lord. Then he continues his journey, advancing by stages as far as the wilderness of the Negev. But the path God has marked out for him will not be easy. As they travel through the Promised Land, an unexpected challenge arises: famine. A severe famine ravages the region, casting doubt on Abram's choice. Had he really abandoned everything for a God he didn't know? Uncertainty began to erode his faith, and Abram made an impulsive decision. He decided to leave the land to which God had called him and flee to Egypt. As he approaches Egypt, Abram realizes a big problem. He knows the beauty of his wife Sarai and fears that the Egyptians, on seeing her, will want to take her for themselves and kill him in the process. So he hatches a plan and tells Sarai, "If anyone asks, tell them you're my sister. That way, they'll treat me well because of you and my life will be preserved." Abram's decision reveals his insecurity and lack of trust in the God who called him. He believes he is guaranteeing his own safety, but in fact, he is about to be plunged into a great deal of trouble. As soon as they arrive in Egypt, Pharaoh's officials soon notice Sarai's beauty and take her to the royal palace. Since they believe she is only Abram's sister, they shower him with gifts, cattle, donkeys, servants, and riches. He is treated as a man of prestige. But God will not allow this mistake to stand. Just as he had done before with those who defied his will, he intervenes. Pharaoh and his household are afflicted by mysterious plagues, and the truth about Sarai comes out. Pharaoh, furious, confronts Abram. "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she was your sister, allowing me to take her as my wife? Now take her back and go." Expelled from Egypt, Abram leaves, taking Sarai and all the wealth he had acquired with him. But this journey has its consequences. As his possessions increase, he and Lot now have so many flocks and servants that the land can no longer hold them both. Conflicts begin to arise between their shepherds, and separation becomes inevitable. Abram, showing wisdom and generosity, proposes a peaceful solution. "Choose which way you want to go. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." When Lot looked around, he saw the fertile plains of the Jordan, a lush land like the Garden of Eden itself. Without hesitation, he chooses the best land for himself and settles near the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, unaware that his destiny would be marked by sin and destruction. Abram, on the other hand, stayed in the land of Canaan, near the oak groves of Mamre, in Hebron. There, once again, he builds an altar to the Lord, but as he seeks to establish his life, war breaks out in the land. A conflict between powerful kings turns the region into a real battlefield. The king of Elam, Chedorlaomer, leads a coalition of 3 other kings and marches to subdue the rebellious cities, including Sodom and Gomorrah. The kings of these cities try to resist, but are defeated. The cities are sacked, and among the prisoners taken is Lot, Abram's nephew. When he hears that Lot has been captured, Abram doesn't hesitate. With surprising boldness, he gathers 318 trained men from his own household and sets out on a rescue mission. During the night, he divides his group and attacks the enemy armies by surprise. The plan works. The invaders are defeated and flee, and Abram manages to rescue Lot and all the looted goods. This unexpected victory does not go unnoticed. Back in the valley of Shaveh, also known as the King's Valley, Abram is greeted by 2 enigmatic figures. The first is Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. He brings bread and wine and blesses Abram with powerful words. "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." Abram, recognizing the greatness of that priest, gives him 1/10 of everything he has conquered. But the second figure to come is quite different. The king of Sodom, who had fled the battle and lost everything, made Abram an offer. "Give me back the people, but keep the possessions for yourself." Abram, however, refuses. He knows that his victory came from God, and he doesn't want anyone to say that he got rich at the expense of the king of Sodom. He declares, "I raise my hand to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and swear that I will take nothing of yours, not a thread, not a sandal strap, lest you say, 'It was I who made Abram rich.'" He accepts only what his men have already consumed and allows his allies to receive their fair share. This attitude of faith and integrity does not go unnoticed by God. Shortly afterwards, the Lord appears to Abram in a vision and says, "Don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be great." But Abram carries a deep sorrow. He turns to God and asks, "Lord, what good is your reward if I'm still childless? My heir will be Eliezer of Damascus." But God gives him an extraordinary promise. "That won't be your heir. Look at the sky and count the stars if you can. So shall your descendants be." And then something incredible happens. Even without seeing any concrete evidence, Abram believes God's promise. And this act of faith is counted as righteousness before the Lord. However, years go by and the promise is still not fulfilled. Sarai, now old and childless, begins to doubt. So she decides to act on her own. She offered her maidservant Hagar to Abram, believing that she could have a child through her. Abram accepts, and Hagar becomes pregnant. Tension soon builds in the house. Hagar, now the mother of Abram's son, begins to despise Sarai. Feeling humiliated, Sarai complains to Abram, who allows her to treat Hagar as she wishes. Humiliated and oppressed, Hagar flees into the desert. But God does not abandon her. An angel of the Lord finds her by a spring of water and says, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her. Your son will be called Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your grief. He will be like a wild donkey. He will live in conflict with everyone around him." Hagar obeyed and returned. And so Ishmael is born, the son Abram had with the maidservant. But he is not the son of promise. 13 years later, when Abram is 99 years old, God appears again and says, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be upright. I will make a covenant between us and greatly multiply your descendants." And then something significant happens. God changes Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many nations. He also changes Sarai's name to Sarah and reaffirms his promise. "I will bless her and give her a son. She will be the mother of nations. Kings will arise from her." Abraham laughs to himself, for both he and Sarah are in old age. But God assures him, "Sarah will give birth to a son, and you shall call him Isaac. With him I will establish my everlasting covenant." And so the promise is sealed. The days go by and God's promise remains firm, even if Abraham and Sarah still find it hard to believe. But then something extraordinary happens. Abraham is resting near the oak groves of Mamre when he sees 3 men approaching. He runs up to them, prostrates himself, and invites them to a meal. Without knowing it, he is standing in front of God himself and his messengers. During the meal, one of the visitors asks about Sarah and then declares, "Next year I will return and Sarah will have a son." Inside the tent, Sarah listens and laughs to herself. At 90 years old, how could she conceive? But the Lord replies, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is there anything impossible for the Lord?" The following year, the promise is fulfilled. Sarah gives birth to a son and names him Isaac, which means laughter, because God has turned her unbelief into joy. Meanwhile, the depravity of the nearby cities reaches its peak. God decides to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness, but before executing his judgment, he reveals his plans to Abraham. Moved by compassion, Abraham intercedes. "Lord, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city?" God replies, "If there are 50 righteous, I will spare the city." But Abraham continued to plead, reducing the number to 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. And God promises, "If there are 10 righteous, I will not destroy the city." But when the angels arrive in Sodom, they find only corruption and violence. Lot, Abraham's nephew, welcomes them into his home, but the men of the city surround the residence and demand that the visitors be handed over to them so that they can abuse them. The angels intervene, blind the aggressors, and order Lot and his family to flee before dawn. As they flee, fire and brimstone fall from heaven, destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. But Lot's wife disobeys the order not to look back. In doing so, she turns into a statue of salt. Abraham observes the destruction of the cities from afar and understands that God's judgment is just. Later, Abraham settles in Gerar, where King Abimelech rules. But in a repeat of his previous mistake in Egypt, Abraham again presents Sarah as his sister, fearing that he will be killed because of her beauty. King Abimelech takes her for himself, but God intervenes through a dream, warning him of the truth. Abimelech returns Sarah and confronts Abraham. "What have you done to us? We could have brought guilt upon our nation." Abraham confesses his fear, and in response, Abimelech not only returns Sarah to him, but also offers gifts and land. Soon afterwards, joy came to Abraham and Sarah's home. As God promised, Isaac is born, bringing laughter and hope. But the peace in Abraham's home doesn't last long. Sarah notices that Ishmael, Hagar's son, is mocking Isaac. Annoyed, she asks Abraham to expel Hagar and her son. Abraham hesitates, but God tells him, "Comply with Sarah's request, for your offspring will be called after Isaac. But I will also make Ishmael a great nation." Hagar and Ishmael set off into the desert. When the water runs out, Hagar, in despair, turns away so as not to see her son die. But God hears Ishmael's cry and sends an angel to comfort her. "Don't be afraid. God has heard the child. Arise, for I will make of him a great nation." Then God opens Hagar's eyes, and she sees a well of water. She and Ishmael survive, and the young man grows up to be a great leader, the father of the 12 princes who will form the Arab tribes. Meanwhile, Abraham prospers and signs a peace treaty with Abimelech. To seal the alliance, he plants a tamarisk tree and invokes the name of the Lord, the eternal God. But just when everything seems to be going well, Abraham faces the greatest trial of his life. One day, God calls Abraham by name. "Here I am," he replies. Then the Lord gives him a surprising command. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you." Abraham's heart must have broken when he heard these words. This was the son of promise, the one through whom his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But Abraham doesn't question it. He trusts that God will provide. The next morning he gets up early, prepares the wood for the sacrifice, and sets off with Isaac and 2 servants. The journey takes 3 days. When he sees the mountain in the distance, Abraham says to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go up there to worship, and then we'll come back." Abraham believes that somehow God will restore his son. He puts the wood on Isaac's shoulders, and the two go up together. On the way, Isaac, innocent, asks, "Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham replies, "God will provide the lamb for you, my son." They arrive at the appointed place. Abraham builds an altar, lays the wood, and ties Isaac to it, laying him on the altar. He raises the knife to sacrifice him, but at that moment a voice calls to him from heaven, "Abraham! Abraham!" He stops immediately. "Don't touch the boy! Now I know that you fear God, for you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looks around and sees a ram caught by its horns in a bush. He takes the animal and offers it in place of Isaac. That day, Abraham calls that place Yahweh-Jireh, the Lord will provide. And indeed, on that mountain, God will provide a definitive sacrifice in the future. God then reaffirms his covenant. "Because you have obeyed me, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars of heaven, and will take possession of the cities of your enemies, and through it all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Abraham and Isaac come down from the mountain, and life goes on. Sarah lives to be 127. When she dies, Abraham buys the cave of Machpelah and buries her there, ensuring that his family would have a resting place in the Promised Land. Before he dies, Abraham takes another wife, Keturah, and has several children. But his spiritual inheritance is passed on to Isaac. At the age of 175, Abraham dies. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, come together to bury him next to Sarah. His journey has come to an end, but his promises live on. The man who left Ur as a simple nomad became the father of a great nation. His faith would shape generations, and from his lineage would come the one who would crush the serpent's head, the true lamb that God would provide for the final sacrifice. This was the legacy of Abraham, the father of faith.